Welcome to this edition of American Purpose. My name is Jack Moline, and I am president of Interfaith Alliance. 60 years ago, Henry Luce, the publisher of Life magazine, invited 10 prominent men each to compose an essay on the national purpose. Then as now, there was a sense that we stood at the beginning of a time of political and cultural change. Our project expands on this work as each episode explores one perspective on where our nation was, where it is, and where it should be heading with a contemporary thought leader. My guests are from the worlds of faith, government, politics, and culture, and they have generously agreed to share this time with us. You can find out more about Interfaith Alliance and our mission to protect your faith and freedom at interfaithalliance.org, and by listening to our radio program and podcast, State of Belief, at stateofbelief.com. But right now, let's find out more about the American Purpose with my guest, Theodore R. Johnson, the R for Roosevelt. He is the author of When the Stars Begin to Fall. And before we dig into the questions here, Ted, will you tell us just a little bit about the book and about the R that is your middle initial?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for having me. So the book is When the Stars Begin to Fall, Overcoming Racism and Renewing the Promise of America. And the argument of the book essentially is that racism is not just this inconvenient thing that we've dragged with us through history, but it is actually a threat to the idea of America, the idea that we're all created equal, that we all have these unalienable rights, including among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. And so the presence of structural racism is actually a sign that the nation state is in breach of the social contract. That is, that we are not being delivered the nation that the Declaration says we should have because of those with power have decided to exclude certain people, certain groups from the promise of America. And we cannot achieve the promise of America unless we address racism head on. My name, as you mentioned, full name is Theodore Roosevelt Johnson III. And the name figures prominently in the book because aside from being a book about history and political science and political philosophy and sociology, it's also about a third memoir and traces my family's American story from slavery through to my time as a military officer in the White House. And so my name was, I'm the third, so it was my father's name and my grandfather's name. And my great-grandparents gave my grandfather the name Theodore Roosevelt Johnson, named after, of course, the president, Theodore Roosevelt, because Teddy Roosevelt, after taking office, invited Booker T. Washington, the prominent civil rights activist and educator, to the White House for dinner, a gesture that had never been done before in the nation's history. Certainly, Black men had been to the White House, often as workers, but even Frederick Douglass, when invited by Lincoln, had to go through the back door, quick meeting, and leave out the back door. Booker T. Washington had dinner with the first family, and this dinner was seen as a sign of racial equality, at least by Black Americans. Many white Americans in the South were really upset with Roosevelt for extending this invitation and holding this dinner. So my great-grandparents, taking inspiration from this dinner of equality, decided to name their third son after not the Black educator, Booker T. Washington, but after the president, Theodore Roosevelt, as a claim on the promise of America and as a political statement of our belonging and desire for inclusion in the nation.
And it's worth mentioning your parents were residents of the southern United States.
Absolutely. South Carolina and Georgia, two of the most places where Jim Crow was most entrenched and violently exercised. And somehow, some way through the faith of their parents and their own hard work and ingenuity, they were able to make it out of there.
Thanks for that. And now let's dive into the questions. In your opinion, Ted, what was the original national purpose of the United States?
Yeah, it's such a thick question. So in my reading of it, the original purpose of the United States was to create a country very different from the monarchies of Western Europe. A country where people were born not in a class or caste, but born into a situation where they could thrive and prosper just as far as their talents and hard work would take them. And that this country would be constructed in a way that would allow self-determination and governed in a way that would provide government with power only to the extent that the people were comfortable with it. And so it was a government responsive to the people and a society and an economy responsive to people's self-determination and their and provide opportunities for them and their people's willingness to prosper, their ability to prosper. I think that's what that is the story that governs the thinking that went into the creation of our nation. We know, however, that a caste system was in place. There were enslaved Black people at the founding of the country. There were Native Americans dispossessed of land. There were white immigrants who were treated as second-class citizens and sometimes as indentured servants. Immigrants from other parts of the world, women couldn't hold property for the most part, could not vote. And so the nation that they sought to create, the nation that they did create, fell short of the rhetoric on which the nation was created. And so sort of the way I'll wrap this answer up is the original purpose of the creation of this country was to allow people to prosper based on their talents and hard work, and to have a government that would be responsive to them. And for the men that created this country, they ensured that government was created for them. But it was not created for all of us present in the country at the time. And we have basically been working ourselves out of what was created into what is possible for creation, given the vision that these men had for the country when they established it. So the original purpose, I think the founders achieved, but what they weren't able to do was constrain that idea to that original purpose. The idea was bigger than the original purpose. And every successive generation of Americans have attempted to create a country that lived up to the language of our founding and not constrain it to the original purpose of the men who created it.
You have an interesting perspective on that, because a lot of people who have had this conversation with me have suggested that there was a sales job going on by the founders to the people who were not included in that vision, that somehow they were or somehow they would be. You're very direct that this was a country founded by the founders, for the founders, and of the founders.
Yes, absolutely. And those like them. It was 90 years before the country decided that maybe we should abolish slavery. Certainly some of the founders were abolitionists and did not want to carry slavery forward, but they did. They allowed it to be so in order to create the nation in the first place. So if the purpose of the nation was this equality, then it could not have been created with slavery intact. And the purpose of the nation was to create a place where those with power were able to manage their power themselves, govern their resources themselves, and not be subjected to the whims of a distant king. That said, I do think the founders were visionary. I think some of the founders directly said, I think it was either Jefferson or Madison, basically, look, slavery is horrible. It's going to die an ugly death on its own in due time. And so they kind of knew that the wheels were in motion for a lot of the things they left unaddressed to eventually be addressed. But the original purpose of the country was not to address the ills of slavery, was not to create equality that was inclusive of all that were present. It was to create a nation that would allow those with power in the colonies to govern themselves and not be under the thumb of a king across the Atlantic.
So here we are now, zooming in on 250 years later. What do you believe is or ought to be the American purpose going forward?
Yeah. And so I think the purpose going forward is the promise of America captured in the second paragraph of the Declaration. And it's sort of what I laid out up top, that we have a nation where we believe all of us are created equal, that we have a nation that believes we have these unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we have a government that derives its powers from the consent of the governed, which means our society is structured in a way that allows people to provide that consent through participation in our democracy, voting, and other means, and recognizes that the people participating are all inherently equal. In terms of how government should protect their rights, their constitutional rights and beyond, and how government should ensure that when those rights are infringed upon, either by government itself or by others, that government does what it takes to remedy that infringement. So the promise of America is the present purpose of our nation. That is it possible for a large democratic republic of more than 330 million people that is diverse in terms of custom, culture, religion, nation of origin, region, gender, sexual orientation, all of these different vectors? Can such a nation so constructed prosper as a liberal democracy? This is a project that's never been accomplished in the history of mankind. We were trying to, they call it the American project, the American experiment, for a reason, because we were trying to accomplish something that's not yet been done. That is the purpose. Our purpose is to see if it's possible for a nation to be so constructed. And if it is, then we will leave for posterity a lesson, a model, a case study on how a diverse peoples can come together into an egalitarian society. If it is not possible, then we will just be another story in history about how differences, racial and ethnic in particular, prevent people from coming together out of self-interest, out of group interest, and unable to find solidarity across lines of difference. Our purpose is to prove that latter story incorrect and the former story made possible.
In spite of all these moving parts.
Yes.
So our society rests on foundational values. Some of them are admirable and some of them are not so much. What are one or two of the values that are worth doubling down on today?
Yeah, so I think, this may sound a little trite, but equality is the one. And I don't mean equality in outcomes. I don't mean that we all get the same house and make the same money and have all the same things. But I mean that we are not, that the journey to the American dream, the access to the American promise is not, no group and no person is unduly hindered to access these things solely based on their race, their ethnicity, their economic position, their socioeconomic status, et cetera. That when structures are presented that make it harder for some people to achieve stability and success than for others, that the government does what is required to ensure a level playing field. And again, not equitable outcomes, but a level playing field. That is incredibly hard. And frankly, it may be the ultimately uncompletable project. It may not be possible to create such a thing as equal opportunity because of class differences, racial differences, but also because of inherent human differences in work ethic and intelligence and ambition, et cetera. We are not all the same creature. We all have, we are distinct in our own ways. And so maybe equal opportunity isn't possible, but more equal opportunity than what we presently have is absolutely possible. Maybe it's not possible to ensure an absolutely level playing field, but a less uneven playing field tomorrow than the one we have today is absolutely possible. So the one value we should really be trying to hold on to is equality. A secondary one, which I think is frankly critical to any kind of liberal democracy in a diverse society, is compassion for people who are different than you. And a real liberal democracy requires sacrifice and forbearance by all citizens. And often people will be willing to sacrifice for their group, be willing to practice forbearance for their group, but will they be willing to do so for another group that maybe they have no connection to, or who they have no contact or friendships with within that group? It must be true if we're going to have the kind of democracy that promotes equality. And in order to do that, we've got to have compassion for one another, especially those democratic strangers we share the country with, who are not yet our civic friends.
And it's not always easy to do that.
Incredibly difficult. In every situation where there is an opportunity for a multiracial coalition to come together, you can bet that there will be people pulling at racial divisions as a way to unwind that coalition, divide the people as a way of and exploit those tensions for political expedience and economic power, prosperity.
Yep.
So it is incredibly difficult. If it was easy, we would have succeeded long ago, and we'd be having a different conversation. And certainly my book wouldn't have been necessary, but it's incredibly hard. Increased social contact in and of itself sometimes grows tensions instead of reducing them. So it's not just about contact. It's about contact with compassion, with superordinate goals and shared objectives, and principled leadership, so that folks across difference can find commonality with one another.
And some of our values are not worth pursuing anymore. What are one or two of the things that are holding us back from the necessary progress that you're talking about?
Yeah, and so I think there's a few bunched together. In fact, I've mentioned like self-determination, individualism, and these are values that aren't inherently bad. But these values in a dog-eat-dog capitalistic society can become very bad things on which people orient themselves and how they interact with the world. And so, if Americans value individualism, so much so that what I want out of my life trumps everything that you want out of your life, then I'm no longer willing to extend equality to you, liberty to you, compassion to you. I'm no longer willing to share resources with you, to include access to democracy, because life is about me and my achievements and my access to resources, my access to government democracy, and not about the collective. So while self-determination is invaluable in helping people overcome hardships, while individualism is valuable in helping people get a sense of self, feel a sense of agency, and of an ability to make a difference in the world, those things let loose in a society that values capital over people, that values the economy over the public good, can be a value that actually exacerbates inequality, exacerbates the threats to democracy, instead of serving as a value on which we can build a more constructive society.
Most of our constitutional guarantees emphasize that commonality that you're talking about. But the first freedom in the Bill of Rights is very personal. Religion, freedom of conscience. Mm-hmm. What values that are rooted in your personal belief system do you commend to those who don't necessarily share those beliefs?
Yeah. I grew up in North Carolina, and I, again, am the child of parents who grew up in Jim Crow and the grandchild of sharecroppers. And so the Christian faith was central to my grandparents' ability to endure discrimination, central to my parents' ability to make their way out of that structure and go to college and be professionals for 30 years. And that Christian faith, I mean, we were a family that we were in church 3 or 4 times a week, and it was almost evangelical in how the church I was raised in practiced their Christianity. But the thing that stands out most to me, frankly, is a theme constant across most religions, which is basically to love your neighbor like you love yourself. And so much of the way I talk about the United States, the ideals of America, our democracy, is basically, can we find a way to practice the civic version of the Golden Rule? Is there a way for me to care about my fellow citizens, my fellow Americans, just like we are compelled in the Bible to love our neighbors as we love ourselves? And that's the lesson that I carry forward. Now, it is very difficult to love other people like you love yourself. So this is, the golden rule is a rule that most of us will never actually be able to practice perfectly forever. But the striving to do so, the little nagging voice in the back of your head when you interact with others, to remember that they are people worthy of dignity and respect. And even in the worst situations, to dehumanize someone is to call the golden rule a lie. That alone can be enough to check our actions and keep a check on ourselves, so that we engage in better faith and with more compassion for others. If we can do that in a democratic sense, in a civic sense, then I think that's the rule that really governs the way I think about the potential for the United States.
I want to draw you out as well on the other belief system that you talk about very eloquently in your book, that emerges from the Black community and its sense of solidarity. You spend a lot of time in the book talking about how that can benefit America. Will you spend just a minute or two with us now, teasing people with it?
Yeah. Yeah, so the book calls for us to build a national solidarity that is multiracial, across class, et cetera. And one of the models I show for how such a solidarity could be created and what it would look like is drawing on the Black experience in America. Now, we often think of the Black experience, Black solidarity, as being a natural outcropping of just being Black, as if we are born with solidarity for one another, just like we're born with the color of our skin and the texture of our hair, et cetera. It's in our DNA. But the Black experience, there is nothing innate about the solidarity we see in Black America. It is constructed. When Black folks were brought to the United States, they were of different languages and religions and tribes and dialects and regions, et cetera. They were not one people, but they became one people out of necessity in the institution of slavery. And that solidarity was created in order to create a sense of security, of community, and of providing a means by which people could endure the hardships that they faced. So in America, we also are not people of the same language and from the same histories and same nations, et cetera. We are very diverse. And we can build a solidarity despite this diversity, not because our skin is the same color, but because we are all Americans that subscribe to the promise and recognize that the future of the country and the well-being of our families, et cetera, are contingent on us sharing in this thing and working towards this democracy, this nation together. So the Black experience provides lessons in how solidarity can be built among a diverse peoples, even though we tend to think of Black American solidarity today as a natural thing because, well, they're all Black. So naturally, there's a solidarity that exists there. It's not that simple. It was something built out of necessity and something that has endured in order to compel the nation to be a better version of itself. The abolition of slavery, the eradication of Jim Crow, and the progress on civil rights were not gifts delivered to Black Americans by the nation or by white Americans. These were things that Black folks came together and worked for in order to compel the nation to be a better version of itself, to live up to its principles. And so that kind of solidarity, not built around material aims, but built around a moral compass, a moral claim to equality, is the same kind of solidarity it's going to require of all of us if we want to create a nation that's more fair and just.
Thank you. Thank you. How should our society pursue our national purpose?
So, I think there's really two primary lines of thought here. One is that we should be better people. And if we are better people, then the way our society is structured and governed will naturally produce better outcomes. Or we can force better public policy that constrains behaviors, provides, sort of social norms that then compel us to be better people. And in the world of like sociology and anthropology, the former is very difficult. That's why we have churches and preachers that sort of, and psychologists that minister to our spirits and our desires and help us govern our own behaviors. But that's not a very efficient way to run a nation of 300 million people by changing 330 million hearts one by one. The more efficient way is to say our society behaves as follows. These things are allowed, these other things are not allowed. And so public policy is the means by which we do that. So to pursue our national purpose, that sort of have the nation that we want, we have to have public policy that compels us to move towards that nation and away from some of the down parts of our history, some of the bad spots in history. So what does that look like? That means protecting voting rights. That means preventing gaming of our democracy so that those with power can hold on to it and the voice of the people is muted by the gamesmanship happening in our politics. It means that we have an economy that rewards people who work and not people who just hold things. And so if you hold lots of land and lots of intellectual property, you can make billions of dollars every year. And then the person showing up to work is making, 400 or like 40,000%, 400,000% less than the people at the top. And so this really unequal distribution of prosperity is part of the reason we have such inequality, which often leads to partisanship and a dysfunctional government. So, allowing people to make living wages based on the work they do, and not an economy structured that allows those at the top to not only stay there, but to prosper under any conditions, while those in the middle and at the bottom are basically subjected to the whims of those at the top. So do we have the ability to structure a society that thinks about healthcare, education, housing, living wages, et cetera, as a thing to be shared, so that, again, to level the playing field and allow us all to prosper? Or do we have a society that's structured so that those with power can hold on to it? And the way they do so is not just by structuring a system to be responsive to them, but also by forcing those of us in the middle and at the bottom to bicker amongst one another about who will have access to the remaining resources, instead of questioning the way the structures operate in the first place, such that we can have the country that frankly the Declaration and the Constitution promise.
That's a big job for all of us writ large.
Yes.
What role does the individual play in pursuing that national purpose?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, in the book, I sort of give these, 5 things that are necessary to set the conditions for this national solidarity. A few of them have individual aspects to them. Of course, one of the main ones is just to be participants in our democracy and not to check out. Democracy doesn't mean vote every 4 years, pay your taxes, and then you get to step away and not think about it anymore. Unfortunately, democracy requires us to think about it routinely and to participate in it routinely if it's going to work properly. If we don't do that, our system of representation suggests we delegate these authorities to people who know better, and they will make sure the country runs properly, and that's just not the way it works. So the one thing we can do is to be active with our voices in local, state, federal elections, to be participants in our democracy through town halls and school board meetings and city councils, et cetera. It means that we can be critical thinkers and informed citizens on the issues confronting the country, whether it's around national security or voting or energy and climate change, et cetera. So the one thing we can do is stay engaged and be informed citizens. The Greeks have a word for this. They called it paideia, which is basically the education of lifelong learning towards citizenship. That's something we don't do well in the United States. We teach kids about the branches of government, but we don't teach people how to be lifelong civic learners and participants. That's one thing we can do. A second thing we can do is service. And so there's active participation in our democracy, but then there's a kind of national service in our communities, organizations, or through the military and other means, where we're giving back to our community, not only doing so for the act of service itself, but because that service often happens in ways that put us in contact with people we would not have met otherwise. And those social contacts in the context of service can often be the way we break down walls and build bridges to one another. And then the last thing I'll say is it was engagement, service, and we have to get out of our comfort zones and get to know people who are unlike us. We live in neighborhoods of people of the same education status, usually, same income levels, usually. We send our kids to the same schools. We belong to the same homeowners associations and PTAs and all of these things. And we don't get to know people who are who are unlike us because we've basically self-segregated ourselves socioeconomically. So one of the most important things we can do is to put ourselves in situations where we are not around people who are just like us, where we're around people with different belief systems, of different classes, of different races and ethnicities, from different regions. And again, that may be uncomfortable, but it's ultimately it is it's rewarding for the individual, but it's really critical to the functioning of our such a diverse country.
Yeah, and I want to encourage people to read your book in general, but specifically to pay attention to your promotion of the notion of national service as a way of creating solidarity. You make a great case for it, and there are other examples around the world where that has served as an important vehicle for creating a sense of national unity in a diverse population.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And of course, I'm biased because of my military service and the benefits from that increased social contact. But as you mentioned, a number of nations have mandatory national service. And in those nations, you tend to find high levels of solidarity.
Yep. So here's the last question, at least the last official question. Are you optimistic about America's future?
You know, I am. Some of it is I just can't help it. That's part of sort of my Christian upbringing. If enslaved people 300 years ago had enough faith to keep living and enduring, and if those 60, 70 years ago under Jim Crow had enough faith to keep living and enduring and believing in our country to be better, who am I to say, nah, this set of problems are too tough and we're not strong enough. So I ultimately do have faith in the American project, if for no other reason than religion or my sort of personal faith, because history suggests that the United States, when it's faced with its toughest challenges, whether it's creating independence or reunifying the nation after a civil war, finds a way to keep the thing intact. And I'd like to believe that the momentum from previous challenges through today will continue to carry us forward. But I don't think it's inevitable. And I do think it is a project that could be lost. So I'm optimistic about the future, but I'm very realistic that perhaps we might not be the people to accomplish this project. And perhaps it'll be our failure that will inspire the next iteration of this in 50 years or maybe 200 years to give it another go. I am very optimistic, however, about the ideals that the nation was founded on, even if the founders themselves didn't live up to them. But society is constructed on the notion of equality across diversity, on access to opportunity and a government that's responsive to the people. I think those things are enduring. And I am very optimistic that those ideas will not collapse. The question is whether we can, if a nation can be built on those ideals alone and endure. And I think we're in a prime position to show the world that it's possible. And the question is whether we're up to the task or not.
Well, you certainly have the perspective from many institutions and communities in the United States. As an academician, as a military veteran, as an attorney, and as a personal veteran of the streets of your childhood, which is what opens the book, and as a member of the Black community. So you have lots of credentials to talk about these things, Ted.
Yeah, no, and we all do. We all have multiple sets of experiences and identities and views that make us such a rich and beautiful country, and we can bring those lessons to bear together to create the nation we all want. I hope. Thank you.
Thanks to you, our listeners, for engaging with us in exploring the American purpose. It's been an honor and a pleasure to spend this time with Ted Johnson, who has shared his perspective so generously. You can listen to this and other episodes at AmericanPurpose.org and learn more about our work at stateofbelief.com and at interfaithalliance.org. Interfaith Alliance has produced this program under the guidance of Ray Kirstein. I am Jack Moline, encouraging you to live with purpose.